What's up?
Hey guys, I'm Josh Hale. I'm the attorney for Dcentral as well as for a lot of other projects in the space. And we all wanted to have a conversation about DAOs and the general ideas of DAOs, also the legalities, also pitfalls, things that maybe you don't think of on a daily basis if you're not actually in the world of DAOs right now. They're an interesting subject. They're obviously a new form of entity, and more specifically, the entity is something that is not even necessarily in all jurisdictions yet as far as a legal entity. So obviously the attorney in me thinks, oh cool, fun stuff, right? But that's not necessarily the way everybody else looks at it. And so I'm interested in having a conversation about how do you guys see DAOs? How do you see the growth pattern from what you saw where they started to where they are now, and why DAO? You want to go first?
Sure. I'm Anastasia Bez from Cadena. So I think that we're still in a very nascent place with DAOs. There's a lot of very cool concepts, but essentially many of them are a group chat on Discord tied to a multi-sig wallet. I think that there's a lot more potential there than what we're currently doing. So I'm excited to see where it goes.
So I would look at DAOs as falling into one of two categories. One is evolutionary and two is revolutionary. So revolutionary is almost easier to understand. It's a DAO that wants to be totally off the grid, right? They're not going to form a legal entity. They're not going to get a bank account. Everyone's hiding behind anonymity of their wallets that they're using to participate. And everything that DAO does will be decentralized and on-chain. And that's great. And we will probably need DAOs like that in the future to fight back against things like government repression. The other kind of DAO, though, the evolutionary one, I think is what's a little more common right now, which is people starting an organization and choosing to run that organization as a DAO instead of as a company or an association or a club, whatever you would have called it otherwise. And in those cases, a lot of these DAOs, I'd say most of them that I talk to, they actually do want to bridge with the TradFi Web 2 fiat world by creating a legal entity, by opening a bank account, or at least having some way of transacting with fiat. So I think there's evolutionary and there's revolutionary DAOs.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning. Morning.
I could see some hands go up there. I think they jacked up the volume, but your good morning wasn't as powerful as mine. So good morning.
Good morning.
All right, okay, at least people are awake now. So I feel that with DAOs, we have an opportunity to trade to a world where we are not just building for one person becoming a mega billionaire, right? But we are building for community prosperity. And what we often fail to not see, right, as a population in general is all of us in this room, we all come from a position of privilege, right? Because we are able to afford paying a couple of $1,000s for planning a whole trip to Miami, purchasing the conference tickets, right? Getting the flight tickets, booking an Airbnb or a room in Hilton, right? Depending on what you can afford. However, there are parts of the world where corruption in those countries are so rampant that the commoners, they have nothing to live for. Let me throw a question here, right? How many of you know, let me just ask, you can just do some guesswork here, right? But the poorest country in the world, what do you think is the average annual income of an individual in the poorest country in the world? Annual income. Take a guess. $60. Annual income.
$1,500.
$300. $300. That country is Burundi. You can go and look it up. 13 million people. Annual GDP of $3 billion for the entire country, $300 per person, right? With DAOs, we can change that.
I think maybe just add one more thing. In those types of environments, DAOs can also add a lot of value because you don't necessarily have the same level of rule of law and even just cultural tradition where a group of people gets together and say, oh, sure, you go open the bank account and we trust that you won't run away with the money because if you do, we'll sue you and you get arrested by the police. In a lot of places, the rule of law isn't so strong, so a paper contract or a handshake doesn't really mean a lot. But now with the DAO, suddenly you have all the power of traditional companies' ability to organize a large number of people, control money together, enforce a contract before, and make it impossible to break. So I think that's really exciting too.
Yep, and the barrier to adoption is actually low, as you mentioned, right? And in fact, in a lot of these countries, you don't have the same sophisticated networks that we're talking about that we have access to in the US. Like today, if in the US you want to send money to someone, you can do everything from not just using your wallets, but also your bank transfers. You have SWIFT, you have SWIFT, you have ACH, you have PayPal, you have Venmo, you have Zelle. There are so many ways of sending money over here. But in those countries, even the infrastructure is lacking. And decentralization, the original motto of Bitcoin was to become this decentralized financial entity where everyone could bank, right? And there are over 1.8 billion people in the world that cannot bank today for the simple reason that banks do not think they are worthy customers. And because these people cannot bank, they automatically lose access to opportunities. Let me ask you this, right? How many of you here run your own businesses? A lot of you. Now, would you be willing to hire someone that you cannot pay at all because you don't have a way to pay them? No hands going up, right? Because obviously, you don't want them to do charitable work for you. You want to pay them. And if there is no way to pay them, how do you hire them? These are the basic problems that we need to solve for. And today with DAOs, we have that power where a community can come together in the interest of the community to help solve for these basic fundamental issues.
I think that there's also a lot around like you're saying, like political organizing or groups that, if they're doing something that is counter to what their country says is the main mode of operating, then they need funding or things like that. DAOs are a really powerful vehicle of support for that.
You made a comment about the idea of revolutionary versus evolutionary. And evolutionary makes sense to most of us in terms of doing business in a new way. The question that I would have as an attorney on the revolutionary side is the assumption you're making is that you make a wallet and it's anonymous. And we all kind of go under that guise today, but if you're old enough, you also went under that guise when BitTorrent was out. And we all learned that BitTorrent also was not private. It also was not anonymous. And my guess is what we're going to see in wallets is the same thing. Absent there being something along privacy, like one of the privacy chains, something like that, there is not necessarily a promise of privacy in the world of wallets even today. So I would argue that the revolutionary side might function today, but I don't know how long that will live.
Yeah, and I think what we've built so far is not the 100% solution, right? But if you think about it, DAOs are to organizing as crypto is to money, right? That same censorship resistance that you can get with Bitcoin, Ethereum, whatever private blockchain, which to your point is not perfect, but it's the best thing we've ever invented that gives you something in that direction. Now DAOs are allowing you to have that censorship resistant for organizing as well.
Absolutely, and I agree with you that it's censorship resistant, but like the term, just like a watch, right? Resistant does not mean waterproof, and I think DAOs are going in that same direction. Resistance does not mean foolproof. And what a DAO has the ability to do is some really cool things. Obviously with governance, you could probably govern a small country or state with a DAO. The problem with it is also that idea of decentralization versus centralization. Of when you have a DAO, it leads to new efficiencies, but it also leads to new inefficiencies. And I'm sure some of you have seen those growing pains in projects that you're interested in or working on yourselves. I'd love to hear about efficiencies and inefficiencies in DAOs that you guys have seen.
I think that one especially with companies in the US that are sort of DAO connected is, are they able to give healthcare? Some of them aren't because you have to connect to a bunch of other structures. And there are obviously ways to do that, but it can be a little complicated for people, I think, to sort of bridge the way that you were saying.
I think one of the biggest challenges is designing organizations that are decentralized from a structural hierarchical standpoint, as many of us who are starting DAOs are trying to do, in a way that they can still operate efficiently and effectively. I think a lot of people are working on that challenge, but I think realistically, most of the DAOs I've been a part of that are fairly decentralized also have challenges with efficiency, effectiveness, consistency, things that we figured out how to do in the corporate world, but in the worlds of DAOs, we haven't yet.
DAOs are new, right? I mean, they are new. So with anything new, you are going to run into hurdles, and the innovation lies in solving for those hurdles. There are two things with us trying to establish our own DAO that we would be launching next quarter. There were two main hurdles that we are still trying to solve for. The first one, as was mentioned, was the jurisdiction, that, hey, how do you really register a DAO as a good entity? And I know my DAO also helps solve the problems. And so far, we have narrowed it down to, okay, Marshall Islands is probably going to be our best bet to go and register a DAO in. But the problem is that, hey, you still can't register it in the US, which is effed up in a way, right? Because the US has been so slow in adopting good regulations. And I know we talk about anonymity, etc. However, in order for the average Joe who doesn't have millions of dollars to gamble, for that average Joe to feel safe in the world of crypto, in the world of Web3, if something is regulated, it makes them feel good, right? And in US, things move so slowly that today you have to go and find alternative means. Registering a DAO as an LLC still makes it centralized. It's no longer a DAO. You can go to Marshall Islands where constitutionally it's recognized as in the Constitution as an organization, so you can go and register it there. So the first problem, it literally starts from, how do I really formalize my DAO beyond a contract, right? Where, hey, if somebody stops working on the smart contract, I don't know what happens. So remember, the O in the DAO stands for an organization. So how do I get legal status for my organization? That's the first problem. Once you have solved for that, then the second problem is that as an organization, you're not just voting on things. As an organization, there are so many things that you do, which the most important fact is, as a community, as a DAO, you're coming together and contributing towards a greater goal. How do you track those contributions? Today, we don't even have an efficient tool stack to really help manage a DAO. The only tools that you really find in the market are tools that you can vote on. If you want to really follow through the entire proposal, right? If you want to see, hey, how are people allocating their time? And let's say your DAO also rewards people for the time that they're allocating. Very hard to really find any of that. And tomorrow, if your DAO services a huge external community as well, where, in your DAO you have different levels. You have governance, people with governance power, voting power, and then you have people who are worker bees in the DAO, and then let's say you're catering to the larger community outside of the DAO. How do you set up a service kind of structure for them? There are so many issues that are plaguing this particular sector for the simple reason that there isn't a lack of good infrastructure available for DAOs to really function. But we'll get through that. I'm seeing tools being built, but at the moment I feel like these are the two biggest hurdles to really creating an organization. Because even with smart contracts, you can't do everything on a smart contract. You have to still kind of go outside. Voting and stuff is great. Distribution of funds, yes, smart contracts can take care of it. But tracking the work that needs to be done, we still don't have a Web3 way of doing that. Tracking the allocation that, hey, if you have put in 80 hours in a DAO and I have put in 10 hours, you need to be rewarded proportionately, right? Those things are just not there.
Interestingly, one of the issues that I see with DAOs is this idea of the so-called silent leaders, where, and I'll give you an example. This is from a lot of years ago. My grandmother was involved in church, and she was part of the church choir and all that stuff, right? And she loved it. And ultimately, if the people at the church wanted to do something in the choir, if my grandmother vetoed it, it was dead. It was dead immediately because she had that power within that DAO, right? And obviously it's not a DAO, but you hear what I'm saying. And you see that even in today's DAOs. You see somebody who has, the popularity vote or whatever whatever you want to call it. And ultimately, when they say something is something they want to work on, people are like, yeah, let's do it, because they follow a leader. And a DAO is supposed to be kind of like a headless leader situation, but that's not naturally how people are. People like having somebody to look to make choices. And that goes against the idea and principles of a DAO, but it's also very natural for us. And it's a growth, maybe a hurdle for sure, as you said, but it's also something that maybe purely decentralized, and forgive me, maybe purely decentralized is not the direction we should be going.
Yeah, and I think there's a really interesting challenge that people run into. They think that forming a legal entity, for example, is going to centralize you because it's creating this like one document and you're in one place in the world. But actually, I think you can use it to be more decentralized in exactly the way you're talking about, because you're combating people just organizing totally organically and naturally into natural social hierarchies where the grandmother gets to veto all the decisions, or you can codify it in your bylaws or your operating agreement and say, like, first of all, this token represents membership, it's one token, one vote. This smart contract gets to make, count the votes and make the decisions for the organization. And now at least you've legally said that this organization is governed in a decentralized way, so people know, and even the law will enforce that grandma doesn't have a veto anymore.
But I think that it's not an issue of legal, it's an issue of social structures. Like, it's human psychology where, some people maybe have the social capital or are persuasive in their rhetoric, and maybe that's also a way that they're contributing, and maybe they should actually get more, ability to sway votes if they're able to cogently present an argument for why a DAO should do something in a way that is compelling to people. I don't think that that's necessarily bad.
I'm going to go back to some of the Web 2 project management stuff that you people might have heard about, right? How many of you have heard, or read the book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team? A few folks. Okay, I see a couple of hands go up. So it's, especially in, all of the big organizations, it's one of the books that a lot of the leadership team, they read through it, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And one of that dysfunction out there is the lack of trust, ownership, and accountability, lack of accountability. So what I have often seen happen, the reason why people follow leaders is because they know that, hey, if this person is proposing something, this person is going to be accountable for it and lead it. Generally, I feel like, especially in the Cardano ecosystem, for example, right? So in Cardano, what you could do is you can actually delegate your vote to someone on your behalf. And I feel like that delegation is important because especially when you look at DAOs, like let's say, the Uniswap, which has a DAO of about 350,000 people. Is each person going to equally contribute? And is each person equally knowledgeable about every single decision that's going to be made in the company? No, right? You're going to have people who are going to have expertise on, let's say, how to create DAOs. You'd have people who have expertise on how to run communities effectively. People with expertise on how to set up good tokenomics. People with expertise on how to create NFTs. So in that case, delegation of your voting rights to the leader actually makes sense. And it's not more so much about decentralizing it, but rather it's more about placing your trust in someone because you expect them to not just propose and get lost, but you expect them to propose, execute, implement, and deliver. And that is important.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think one of the assumptions that a lot of people in Web3 make about DAOs is that they need to be the complete opposite of what we used to do with companies, corporations, nonprofits, et cetera. So instead of having a top-down, start small at the top, hierarchical leadership and management structure, they want the complete opposite, right? No management, no one in charge, sometimes they say no leaders, which is probably the worst thing. But I actually think where the most successful DAOs are finding success is in being willing to combine a little bit of the old model with a little bit of the new model. And in particular, I think what's most important for a DAO to remain a DAO is that the ultimate governance rights still fall in the hands of the people. But then if those people choose to elect a CEO for their DAO, I think that's fine. They can always unelect, fire the CEO. They can take away their budget. They can tell them, you better change how you're doing things or we're going to fire you. And to me, that's still a DAO. So I do think we will see a lot of DAOs with head chefs or CEOs and maybe things that we traditionally see in other organizations.
I absolutely agree with that idea. In fact, it's a lot of times what I advise people when they're coming to my office for legal advice is that, yes, you can do decentralization. That doesn't necessarily have to mean that, everybody's a soldier and you have no generals. That's something that people need to wrap their head around, that they're so focused on the idea of what decentralized is supposed to mean in their head that they kind of break the idea of being able to operate. The other question that I have for you guys that I think a lot of people gloss over is we've talked about decentralization now for roughly 15 minutes. I haven't heard anybody talk about the second word of DAO, autonomous. What does it mean for your businesses? What does it mean in what you see overall? And why is it being glossed over? Because everybody focuses so much on, you gotta decentralize. I don't see anybody focusing that much on, you gotta make this autonomous, you gotta make it just function, you gotta build the smart contract to make this DAO function. We can do it on Discord, it'll be fine. But nobody's focusing on it. Why?
So one of the things I want to mention is, when we think about autonomy, right? Let's remove autonomy in the concept of DAOs. What do you mean by autonomy? Being able to make having that decision-making power to make those decisions on your own, right? So that's the first thing that we need to really look at, because traditionally, even the larger organizations have tried to now move from a centralized to decentralized structure, where the decision-making power is being slowly moved down, right? I mean, a lot of you must have heard about agile transformations. I have led agile transformations in company, and the entire idea was that, hey, if you're a simple example is if you're hiring a developer, why do you need the CEO to sign off on that? Because that's a decision that's better made at the team level. As long as they know what are the constraints within which they can actually operate, you make them capable enough and you give them the right tools to go and make those decisions autonomously. So that's the first thing. And the other thing that I'd want to mention is I completely agree with you that, hey, we often don't look at it, but also what I feel is when we look at autonomy, we think that, okay, the only way to make people in the community autonomous, remember the DAOs, the smart contracts, the tech is meant for the people. So when you're saying that, you have a decentralized body, the decentralization means, you have people around the globe, for example, right, working on it. When you say it's autonomous, by autonomy, you mean people have the autonomy, not just a smart contract, right? But the people empowered by the smart contract have that autonomy, right? So the thing that I would like to mention right now is smart contracts aren't the only way to provide that autonomy to people.
I do think there is also a more future use case that's really exciting, that's more autonomous. Imagine a smart contract with legal standing in Wyoming or the Marshall Islands. These are two places at least where it says in the law that you can turn control of the organization over to a smart contract. Right? And the assumption is that smart contract is counting votes on proposals that people are making, but nowhere does it say that you can't have a smart contract that's actually making some, most, or all of its decisions on its own, right? Maybe it's pulling in data from an oracle. Maybe there's a drone or a fleet of driverless cars that has its own DAO. Maybe there's people involved. Maybe once there were people involved, but not anymore. And now that smart contract really is autonomous, almost like an autonomous robot.
I'm gonna make sure there's no bugs in that code then.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to say, that, hey, it's like, it's going to be like a RoboCop movie, right, where you have AI making all of the decisions for you. But it could happen, especially for the mundane tasks. I feel that everything that we're marching towards in Web3, it's to elevate the quality of human life. It's not to make more money or become more successful, become more richer. It's about trying to get rid of some of the huge gaps and the large chasms that we're talking about, right? Where on one end of the world, you have people who really don't get 3 square meals a day, and on the other hand, you have people who are buying a yacht to put 3 yachts on it, right? So Web3 should be taking us to an ecosystem where people don't have to struggle as much, where the quality of human life becomes better. And with that in mind, I feel like, as you mentioned, right, that, hey, with smart contracts, you could actually have smart contracts governing smart systems. And when I talk about smart in this context, I'm obviously talking about level 5 of autonomy, of AI, right, where the AI is able to make all the decisions. And yes, the DAO contract, the smart contracts, could actually be the the purview, the jurisdiction within which it has to operate. So it has some kind of ethics also built into it. So, at the end of the day, the AI is servicing the people, not ruling them, right? And then people can focus on uplifting their quality of life by helping each other out.
So we talked about the idea of glossing over the term autonomous. And you said something very poignant before, that the smart contract, the use case, whatever you're using, Discord or whatever, right, to do your voting, to rule the DAO, is built for the people, right? And we also gloss over the last term of DAO. We so focus on decentralized forever. I mean, like every time you guys go, we even focused on it in the way we describe what a DAO is. It's called a DAO. It's not an OAD or however you'd say it, an ADO. We focus on the first term, but the last term is exactly what you said. It's for the people. An organization is people. Like if you look it up, all it says about an organization is it's a group of people that are coming together for a particular purpose. And I think the term organization should probably be the strongest term in the term DAO, because that's what we actually focus on in DAOs, right? You focus on a particular purpose of what you want to give back to the world, whether you're trying to maybe in disagreement with you, whether you're trying to make more money, whether you're trying to make sure that people have 3 square meals a day, whether you're trying to give licensing rights for music, whatever the case may be. But ultimately, you're coming together for a particular purpose. And I would love to hear the particular purpose that each of you are coming together in any of the DAOs you're involved in, because I think that's the most interesting thing, is why come together?
Well, I'll just briefly say I'm involved in a lot of DAOs, partly because my job is to help provide legal entities for DAOs. But one of my favorite DAOs that I'm a part of is DAO Planet, which is a DAO that puts on DAO-focused events, including the other stage today is hosted all day by DAO Planet. It's cool because it attracts a lot of people who are really excited. Let's say you're here and you're really excited about DAOs and you want to get more involved. Come to the DAO Planet Discord server, introduce yourself, share what you're interested in and what skills you have, and pretty soon you could be one of the people helping put together, recruit speakers, organize events that are focused entirely on DAOs.
I'm very interested in the idea of figuring out how to use DAOs to connect to local government. So for people to be able to come together and be involved in zoning board decisions and things like that, because it's currently very inaccessible. Sometimes, like in my community, for example, you have to log onto a Zoom meeting that lasts like 5 hours. And it would be great to be able to organize in advance what you're asking for so that you can then have an impact with a group of people. This doesn't necessarily exist, so if you think it does, please come talk to me.
So based on whatever I've said, I think what we're working on is probably quite evident. We are working on creating a DAO that actually helps people go from Web3 uninformed to Web3 curious to Web3 empowered. And when we think about Web3 empowered, it means people who have careers in Web3, not just as traders, not just as flippers, but taking up real full-time careers in Web3. And especially the areas, the demographics that we want to impact are demographics that have been traditionally underrepresented in tech in the past. And also, that's not just like having more women in, having more people of color in, having more folks from the LGBTQIA community, and all the communities that in the past we have on purpose or not on purpose discriminated against, but also regions like Africa or Southeast Asia. So in Africa, there are 24 countries in Africa where the average annual income of an individual is under $1,000 a year, right? So in the nation Burundi, for example, adding $100 to their baseline income means increasing their annual income by 33%. Right. So those are the microeconomies that we want to target, and we want to do that by a mix of educating people, right, making them Web3 informed, and then giving them those Web3 credentials. So with those credentials, they can apply for jobs in Web3 and basically make careers and living in Web3.
Guys, I'm sure each one of you are on some form of social media. tell the audience how to find you if they want to see what you're doing, because obviously we're all here for a particular purpose. We're here not only to learn about Web3, to learn about DAOs, but we may each have expertise that people want to hear about. So how do they find you on social media or whatever you want?
You can look up Orbis86. At the moment, we are working on our NFT project, but as you follow along and look for our announcement on Orbis86 World of Wings, that's all focused on the impact and the DAO that I'm talking about.
For me, my podcast called Just DAO It, the podcast for people starting DAOs. Check it out on your favorite podcast platform. Lots of good guests on that show. I'd love to have you guys on sometime soon. And for me, I feel really insecure about not having enough Twitter followers, so please follow me on Twitter. It's 0xThriller.
You can follow me on Twitter. It's Anastasia Bez, B-E-Z.
Guys, as I said, I'm the attorney for Dcentral as well as for a lot of organizations. You can find me anywhere you want to under Josh. And if you want to listen to our podcast, we do podcasts under Non-Fungible Counsel. And if you're interested in these sort of topics, we do LinkedIn audio every 2 weeks. And you can find me on LinkedIn under Josh Hale or do a search for Josh. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.